Okay, so this is the second in a series of two short tutorials that look at the October Revolution. The first examines the various factors that led to the occurrence, and this second one will go through the chain of events and the time frame and the timeline essentially of the revolution of itself that resulted in the overthrowing of the provisional government. So the first thing that takes place um, in the end of September, beginning of October of 1917, is the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Petrograd Soviet actually set up headquarters in the same building. It was an old convent school in Smolny in Petrograd, which actually was once the school of the daughters of very wealthy Russian families. And you can see it was quite an impressive building. And that's where both the Central Committee and the Petrograd Soviet based themselves from September onwards. Lenin returns in secret on the 17th of October and he meets with the Central Committee to try to convince them in person that now is the time for revolution. Kerensky senses that revolution is on the cards and actually sends some radical elements of the armed forces into Petrograd to try and restore peace. The Bolshevik-controlled Soviet claimed that this was proof that Kerensky was looking to abandon the capital and was going to allow it to fall to the Germans, who were edging closer to the Russian cities by the week. In response to this, the Central Committee and the Petrograd Soviet established a military revolutionary committee. It was set up under the guidance of Trotsky and Jasinski on the 9th of October. It included 66 members, 48 of whom were Bolsheviks, and it was their job to appoint commissars who would lead units, army units, and issue orders and weapons to them. This revolutionary committee controlled 200,000 Red Guards, who were actually, armed during the July days and during the Kornilov affair. 60,000 Baltic sailors and 150,000 soldiers from the Petrograd garrisons. This convinced people that this revolutionary committee were planning actually to protect the capital against a right-wing military coup. And so that allowed them to gain some popular support. On the 10th of October, Lenin convinced the Central Committee that an armed rising was the order of the day. He won this vote 10-2. The two people that refused were Zinoviev and Kamenev, the real Bolshevik leaders in Petrograd. Kerensky, in response to this, closed down two Bolshevik newspapers and ordered that all bridges connecting working class areas to the capital were razed. This gave the Bolsheviks reason to pounce. And on the night of the 24th of October, the Petrograd Revolutionary Committee ordered that 5,000 sailors, soldiers and Red Guard were to seize key positions, and you can see those key positions on this map, and the map also actually gives you the chronology of events. So it's well worth pausing the video on this, and you can go through this at your own pace. So those key positions included the telephone exchange, the post office, railway stations, news agencies, the state bank, bridges and power stations. Now, in most cases, the troops that were guarding these areas just gave in without any real resistance. However, 3,000 more troops were arriving in the morning. Kerensky himself actually left for the front. He was struggling to find soldiers that were going to fight in support of the provisional government. He couldn't find nearly enough in Petrograd itself, so he left for the front to try and contact loyal troops. The rest of the provisional government met in the Winter Palace, and on the evening of the 25th of October, the Red Guard surrounded the palace, and a blank shot was fired from the Aurora battleship. Now you can see the Aurora battleship basically just sailed through Petrograd in a very intimidating fashion. Now, several shots were fired from that battleship. Only one actually scuffed the Winter Palace. The rest were just fired into the river. But it was, as you can imagine, a very intimidating sight, and it was a clear indication that the armed forces and the Russian Navy were in true support of this revolution. So on the evening of the 26th of October, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets held its first session. The chairman Kamenev announced that the Petrograd Soviet had seized power and a new governing committee was to be established under Lenin's leadership. This was going to get the name of the Zovnarkom. This new committee was all Bolsheviks or left-wing social revolutionaries, and even one woman. However, just because they were from the same end of the political spectrum did not mean that they all agreed. 80 Mensheviks and 180 right-wing social revolutionaries objected. They said that this was not a Soviet coup, but a Bolshevik coup, and in many ways they were actually correct. So what you have here is a diagram of various members of this Zovnarkom. Some names will be very familiar to you. Obviously, the chairman, Lenin, Trotsky leading foreign affairs, Joseph Stalin was leading the management of nationalities. And then we've got Felix Dzerzhinsky, who later becomes the leader of this secret police, and the Cheka, very pivotal figure once the Bolsheviks consolidate power. So as the right-wing social revolutionaries and Mensheviks storm out, Trotsky taunts them. And once they'd left, Lenin proclaimed that we will now proceed to construct the socialist order. The very next day, he issued a decree on peace, which called for the immediate stopping of the war, something that peasants have been calling for quite some time, and a decree on land, announcing that all land was property of the people and was to be redistributed by the village Soviets. Again, something that he had promised in his peace-bread land April thesis, and also something that the peasants were after and were really disappointed that the provisional government had failed to do. So, how big was this? How big was this revolution? Well, only around 25 to 30,000 workers and soldiers were actively involved in the revolution. And so if you think about the population of Petrograd, that's probably only about 5% of the workforce. About 10 to 15,000 were stood outside Winter Palace on that night, but many were just bystanders. Surviving photographs, of which there are very few, suggest that forces were small, but the Bolsheviks later claimed that it was a much bigger popular revolution, as you would expect. Now, Trotsky himself said that the October Revolution was a result of small, calculated operations, and as a result this meant that much of the city was unaffected by events in October. So in the final days, Kerensky failed or refused to lay down. He managed to convince 18 Cossack regiments to fight for the provisional government, and there was 10 days of heavy fighting in Moscow. There was also some opposition in Kiev, Kazan and Smolensk, but here Lenin agreed to inter-party talks and further troops were convinced to defect by Bolshevik activists and thus saving the revolution.